Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, where we take a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues facing the country. By that count, one major issue currently top of the mind is the debate regarding the role of the Planning Commission. In some ways, it's been a perennial debate. Every few years, there are calls for reform of the Commission. This time, however, there's an added urgency. The government-appointed Independent Evaluation Office, headed by Ajay Chibber, has recommended that the Commission be scrapped and replaced by a Reform and Solutions Commission. It has an ally here. The present Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, was a strong critic of the Commission when he was a Chief Minister of Gujarat, saying that it is always taking a top-down approach and lecturing the state governments. So is it curtains for the Commission? Has it outlived its utility and become an extra-constitutional, unaccountable political authority? Or will it rise once again and in maybe some other form? Joining me in this discussion are Ajay Chibber, the first Director General of the Independent Evaluation Office, set up to assess the effectiveness of India's planned programs, B.K. Chaturvedi, former member Planning Commission, and Sudha Pillai, former member Secretary Planning Commission. Welcome to the show. Let me start with you, Ajay. Very simply, if I were to ask you, would you call the Planning Commission an anachronism in today's times?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on your show, Mythili. The Planning Commission is a venerable old institution, but and it was probably very useful for the time when it was set up. But times have changed and the economy has changed, people's aspirations have changed, the issue of center-state relations has changed, and the Planning Commission has not changed with the time. So I think it is time to take a hard look at what is the role and function of the Planning Commission and try to reform it or retrofit it to what is needed today.
How would you react to that, Mr. Chaturvedi? Would you call it an anachronism, or is it just something that has to be just tweaked to suit today's times?
No, I would say that Planning Commission is very much relevant in a reformed form. In fact, countries like South Africa have set it up recently in consultation with us because they saw the advantages of it. I recall my recent discussions with the US, and they were asking us that how do you manage your plans, how do you do it for 5 years, how do you do it for a couple of years. China has got NDRC, which is a reformed version of Planning Commission, and of course Russia has Gosplan. Gosplan is fine, but China has done very well. So this is quite clear that there is a need for it. Every country, has to have a plan and projections for which you are going to do for 5 years, for 10 years, in the medium term, on a long-term basis. So you must have an organization doing it. This job has to be done.
Very briefly, if I were to toss a question to you, Sudha, how would you kind of put it, just in 2 sentences or 3, anachronism or very current and very relevant?
Actually, if you go back to the original purpose for which the Planning Commission was set up by a resolution of the Government of India, I think those functions continue to be relevant. And if you just quickly look at those functions, they were to appraise the available resources, material, human, and also capital resources. And the Planning Commission was also actually meant to look at the way those resources could be augmented, and to look at actually the ways of augmenting it, and also indicate which were the impediments, what were the impediments, and how to actually remove those impediments for better achievement. Now these are macro issues. So it is the macro issues which continue to be relevant, and those macro issues cannot be wished away.
Ajay, the Planning Commission is always seen, very often identified with just as a body which makes the plans. But the Planning Commission has many other functions apart from just drawing up the plan. It appraises the programs, it acts like a think tank, it intermediates between different ministries, between the states and the center. Are all these functions irrelevant, or are some of these functions still very relevant in today's times?
I think change is needed in almost all of these functions, because what is needed is really a change in the way we are thinking about all these issues, which are and need to have an institution that will perform some or all of these functions, but in a very different way. We need a very different approach. We don't need a top-down centralized plan approach. What we need is much greater flexibility being given to the states in how they will approach some of the problems that they are facing, because over the last 2 decades, states have moved at very different rates of development, and the levels and problems and levels of development and the problems and challenges that they face are quite different. The other function that we heard needs to change is the kind of resource allocation function, because at the moment the Planning Commission kind of takes off so-called plan expenditure, which is roughly akin to what one would consider to be development expenditure. But this, as the Rangarajan Committee noted, this distinction between plan and non-plan expenditure has become quite irrelevant now. And in any case, if you go back to the Constitution, there was a Finance Commission that was actually established to do the allocations between the center and the states. Then we come to the think tank function. Over time, the quality of the domain expertise of people in the Planning Commission had atrophied hugely, so that now when people were coming to the Planning Commission, they were not finding the kind of innovative ideas and solutions that they had expected to find from the Planning Commission. And in fact, the word that was used on us was it had become more of a control commission. When you look through all the major functions of the Planning Commission, we need those functions, but the way the current Planning Commission was performing those functions needed to be changed considerably.
Mr. Chaturvedi, Ajay seemed to suggest that the Planning Commission as it is today is falling short on almost every single function that it is required to perform. Would you agree, or would you like to kind of make some kind of, is there a nuanced position that you would like to take?
No, I think that in my opinion, Ajay has not really very well understood and appreciated the way Planning Commission functions, and all the 3 issues that he mentions, I have a different approach. I mean, take for example the questions that he mentioned about whether the plan allocation functions should be there with the Planning Commission. My discussions with other countries in South Africa revealed, and we had discussed also informally with the Finance Commission, and everyone said that in case you have it purely as a think tank function, then it is another body which will give its report. And I remember when I went to South Africa, their minister was asking me that how do you ensure that the plan gets implemented? We have sent a plan and the ministries have said that, well, we will have a look at it when we have time. So the difficulty is that it is important that we have the resource allocation function. And as for the Rangarajan Committee's recommendations, what they have said in fact was, maybe it has not been very well understood, that the plan and non-plan differentiation is not very valid, but for that purpose, since the Finance Ministry doesn't have the requisite domain knowledge or experience, therefore the Planning Commission must do this both for the non-plan as well as the plan for a large body of expenditure, particularly health, education and developmental expenditure, on which there are views in the government and the Ministry of Finance.
So now, apart from the resource allocation role which states strongly resent, particularly in a federal republic, do you think that there is a case for rethinking that role as well, or only that role needs to be rethought, other roles, think tank, etc., can continue?
Actually, I think there is very poor understanding of the way state budgets are formulated and passed. Very frequently when the states come for plan discussions, they've already actually have a budget which has been actually adopted in their assembly. So the question of large scale interference in the state's plan does not arise.
So it is not a top-down approach.
What actually happens during the state plan discussions, and here I would actually like to just spend a minute on the approach. Okay. The approach that you have to adopt when you are discussing with the state governments is the approach of a friend and a helper. Okay. Frequently what happens in all organizations, that after some time when you look at the macro picture as it's emerging in many states, you tend to actually assume superior knowledge, and maybe the tone in which you speak is actually not proper. So, but let me throw up bits and pieces that you pick up and which should be a matter of great concern. It's only when you analyze a state's resources position that you actually can pick up important nuggets. The Planning Commission may have actually assumed a role a larger role than was originally intended because of the plethora of centrally sponsored schemes. Both Mr. Chaturvedi and I have been strong advocates of the abolition of the centrally sponsored scheme regime, the silo approach of many ministries, and enabling the state governments to have more money at their disposal to plan, according to their priorities. That is something I want to really point out, that such information comes out only when you sit and analyze.
Okay, so on that note, we'll have to slip into a very small break, but please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're trying to discuss the new role for the Planning Commission, if at all there is a role, and what that role should be. Ajay, can you just list out the main recommendations of your IEO office for the benefit of our viewers?
The whole issue of center-state allocation of resources should be really left more to the Finance Commission, and then should be deliberated in an adequate manner, in the preparation of the report of the Finance Commission. And if necessary, a smaller secretariat of the Finance Commission can be kept alive on a permanent basis to be able to provide the background information to the Interstate Council or the National Development Council meetings that take place. Number two, what we have recommended is that the resource management function between the central ministries could easily be handled by the Finance Ministry with support from, as I said, one or two divisions that currently exist in the Planning Commission. And the third recommendation we have made is to set up, either reform the existing Planning Commission, which would not be my preferred option, but to set up a body that would, we call it the Reforms and Solutions Commission. We are not saying we should scrap the Planning Commission, we're saying we need this new body. And whether it's through a reform of the existing one, which would be much harder, I think, personally from my experience, or to set up a new body, that's a decision, of course, for the government to take.
Sudha, Ajay just spoke about how, they feel that the Finance Commission is already there to decide center-state sharing of tax resources. So why do we need a Planning Commission? How would you react to that? Because the Finance Commission is a constitutional body. There's always this charge that the Planning Commission is not a constitutional body. The members are appointed at the whims and pleasures of the government in power. And all this takes away greatly from the independence, quote unquote, of the Planning Commission. So is a Finance Commission enough? And do we not need a Planning Commission?
I think again, I feel that Ajay doesn't know the system very well. There is actually indeed a Ministry of Planning. The Planning Commission is a creation of March 1950, but the Ministry of Planning, with the Secretary and MOS, and usually, but not now, the Prime Minister, is actually part of the accountability structure. So there is in every state also a Department of Planning. So you may have a planning board, and you do have a Department of Planning. In the central government, you have a Ministry of Planning and you have a Planning Commission. So the question is that the Finance Commission, as it is set up, it's also a commission, and it's set up and it leaves behind a very small section, which actually in my during my stint as State Finance Secretary in the government of Kerala, I found that section is not able to cope up with the implementation of the recommendations. And I think perhaps Ajay should be making an appraisal of that also, because if you try to cut and pair to see whether or not the Finance Commission would be able to take on the additional responsibility, then the Finance Commission would have to be a permanent body.
Mr. Chaturvedi, if I can draw you in on another recommendation that he mentioned, that the Planning Commission should play more of a role of a think tank and think in terms of longer term perspective planning. How would you react to that?
Well, I would give my views, but before that, on this question of Finance Commission, I wanted to mention, add to what Sudha said. You see, the Finance Commission is under the Constitution. It is somewhat of a juridical body in the sense that it decides between the center and the states, so vertical devolution, horizontal devolution amongst these states. So because of this nature, government has been giving a lot of weight to its recommendations and been accepting all its recommendations. If it were also to do the plan function and this thing, it has, first of all, it doesn't have the bandwidth, as she mentioned, stays for 2.5 years. Second, there's nothing, no additional knowledge in that. And third, if there's a worry which people say that it is because the Planning Commission has a political pointies and this could maybe, by and large the experience is that the recommendations of the allocation of the Planning Commission have also been well respected, and that of Finance Commission, I remember I was a member of the 13th Finance Commission also. The recommendations have been criticized by a number of states, whichever states didn't get their adequate. So to say that it has universal acclaim and Planning Commission does a political job is absolutely, first of all, incorrect. And in my opinion, this is, without it, the think tank has no value. Now the think tank business. As far as the think tank is concerned, yes, Planning Commission must have more domain knowledge, and I would agree with that part of Mr. Chibber's recommendations, that there is a need to further enhance the domain knowledge within the Planning Commission, have more organizations attached to it so that it has more of a think tank role. But this think tank role, our experience is that there are a large number of reports on China, reports on climate change. We have TERI, which is giving reports on the field of energy. We have the institutes which is giving reports on the in the field of road. There are a large number of committees. Now, question is that it is operationalizing those policy questions is a major concern. Now, you can't really say that we will have a think tank a report. Otherwise, what will going to happen is that we will be working on reports which no one will read, no one will be interested in. But I would like to add a last point. I'm afraid you didn't ask, but I consider it a very important role of the Planning Commission, and that is discussions with the states. This is the only body today, apart from the central council, interstate council, which has the ears and constant dialogue with the states. Interstate council doesn't do on plan matters very well. So in case we must have a body which has a constant dialogue with the states on their problems, whether they are needing royalty, whether hill states are being developed, whether what will happen the northeastern states of what is happening to the left-wing extremism in the states. What are their problems?
Toss that question to Ajay here. Ajay, Mr. Chaturvedi spoke about dialogue with the states. Sudha talked about, the approach of the Planning Commission. Now, is that part of the problem? That this Planning Commission is seen as a very top-down approach, and it goes against the very grain of what we'd like to see and what the Prime Minister talks about, cooperative federalism.
Yeah, I think, as I said, what it has become more now a hindrance to the kind of development that India wants to see rather than a supporter of that development. Because what India is looking for is not a centralized model for development. In fact, different parts of India are looking for different solutions, different approaches, and experimentation is up in the air. We've now had Rajasthan trying to say we'll move ahead on labor reforms. I'm just using that as an example. Different states want to do approach employment guarantee schemes in a different way. Different states want to try out different models for health, for education. So these centralized approaches are no longer working. And while the Planning Commission in a way epitomizes this centralized approach, I mean, there are flagship programs of the central government. Not all of them are emanating from the Planning Commission. But somehow the Planning Commission symbolizes this centralized approach to doing things. So we need other reforms as well, not just the reform of the Planning Commission.
Well, I'm afraid on that note, we need to slip into another short break, but please do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the role of the Planning Commission in today's times. Sudha, it's often said that if the Planning Commission did not exist, you'd have to reinvent it, you'd have to create it in some form or the other. Is that correct? Would you agree with that assessment?
If you strip it down to what its original function was, I think you would need to have somebody looking at that function, and not just as a think tank, because a think tank is a waste of money. Government, I think, can use the input from other think tanks. You should not have Planning Commission as a think tank, which doesn't mean that Planning Commission should not have domain knowledge. And I'm surprised at what Ajay said, because 1977, to say that there was greater domain knowledge in a decade which is considered to be a lost decade for development, I think we are much better off today. And it is not just that the Planning Commission doesn't consult outsiders. Every plan actually is, the central plan I'm talking about, is actually based on discussions with, I think, thousands of people, physically and also through the medium of the computer.
So, Mr. Chaturvedi, would you agree that it's something like the king is dead, long live the king? So, will it be like that with the Planning Commission? You say, wind up the Planning Commission and it re-emerges in another form?
Well, first of all, I think that the question of winding up or re-emerging is premature, because they have given the report and government would have a look at it. Secondly, it is absolutely wrong to say that Planning Commission represents centralized. In fact, on the contrary, Planning Commission represents decentralization of schemes, and that's what has been done in the current budget. When we have all the centrally sponsored schemes, we have decentralized, given functions to the states. But one function you cannot take away, which is the constitutional function and responsibility. See, under the Constitution, under the directive principles of the state policy, you have said that you will provide education, you will provide health, you will provide Panchayati Raj institutions, you will provide these facilities in various parts of the country. Now, are we going to say, and this is what is happening in other federations like Canada, like Australia, everyone does that, but are we going to say that these responsibilities should be dumped on the states and we should just sit quietly and watch? So, this is my worry, is that labour reforms, all reforms, it is completely, Planning Commission has been all for it. So, if there is any function which is centralized, to my opinion, I don't really understand. And which function is Ajay referring to as a highly centralized locations and functions? I'm really amazed. He got that, because I couldn't catch it in the period of 7 years. I don't know which function did he get it. But I think that this is a completely decentralized approach, particularly in the plans. Increasingly, it is not possible for Planning Commission to do a centralized function. What you can do is to provide more and more support to the states, more and more support to the development in the states and on their policies, and that's what the Planning Commission does.
So, may I say one thing?
Sure, please.
If the Planning Commission is to be retained, then it's very important for Planning Commission to remember that it's not a super ministry, that it cannot break the back or the knees of any ministry. It has happened in the past that some ministries were actually, their powers were shifted to 1 or 2 people in the Planning Commission, which is not actually contemplated. Secondly, in our tone and tenor, in the tone and tenor of our discussions with the state governments, I don't think we have any role of lecturing state governments. I think that is something which is resented and which needs to be totally avoided.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have in this edition of Macros with Mythili. Clearly, there is no agreement on the role of the Planning Commission. Both Mr. Chaturvedi and Sudha feel there is a role. Ajay feels quite differently, but we'll have to wait and watch and see what the government decides. Thank you, Ajay, so much for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Chaturvedi. Thank you, Sudha, also. And thank you for watching Macros with Mythili. We'll be back next week, same time, with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.